All right, welcome. Thanks for joining me here with Freedom is Scary #4. This is the fourth in a line of live stream casts that I've done both on YouTube and also on my Facebook page, where we discuss civil rights laws. We discuss a lot of the COVID or lack of legislation and lawsuits. And we discuss history as well. So I think they both go together at this point very well. What I wanted to discuss today was to give an update on our lawsuits against the West Virginia governor, or our lawsuit at this point. Just yesterday, and as you know, if you've been following along in this process where we've been fighting against the tyranny of the West Virginia governor, you know that we filed a writ of mandamus, and I've explained about 100 times now what a writ of mandamus is. But it doesn't matter anymore, like I've said, because we're going a different route because the West Virginia Supreme Court denied a writ of mandamus. But just yesterday, I got a bunch of text messages from people telling me to look at the podcast of the Tom Roten show from yesterday, because one of the West Virginia Supreme Court justices was apparently interviewed by Tom Roten yesterday and discussed at length our writ of mandamus. And of course, the question was also posed to him, well, what the hell is a writ of mandamus? And I'm sure everybody's tired of asking that question or hearing that question answered at this point. And, if you look at the whole concept of judicial review itself, like day one of law school, day one of constitutional law, the very first case that you learn about is Marbury versus Madison. And that's when the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Jay, wrote this opinion that basically established the concept of judicial review, that we have a judicial branch that can review the other two branches, that can review legislation and declare it to be unconstitutional, that can review the actions of the executive branch and declare it to be unconstitutional. So that was a writ of mandamus case. Now, it's still, I don't think, made a whole lot more sense in the time of Marbury versus Madison on what the hell is a writ of mandamus. As the Supreme Court justice explained yesterday, and probably as I should have explained the numerous times I've tried to explain on the radio what a writ of mandamus is, but it is Latin for we command you to do something. So it is a very old and important component of our judicial system. But the only real reason it was used here is because it was really the only way to invoke what's called the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It's the only way really to skip all the middlemen and go straight to the body that, in our view, at least, should have decided this issue, and which may still decide it. And that's what I'm going to give an update on here. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, Carmen and Freedom TV. Thanks for joining me. I'm not going to have a panel today, but if you have any questions, maybe write a comment in all bold, and maybe I'll see it, and I can bring check this out. I can bring your comment and your picture up on the screen, and I may be able to answer some questions. Try not to ask me any questions about your specific circumstances, because that's something that generally you have to pay me for first, unless it's an extraordinary circumstance. So I'm not giving specific legal advice here. I'm just answering legal questions, if you have any, about what I'm talking about anyways. And I get a lot of questions about the COVID-19 emergency order stuff. What's legal? Can they do that? Can they not do that? So I'd be happy to give you my answer to some of those general type of questions, though it may not be that helpful, unfortunately. And the reason it may not be that helpful, because it may be my opinion that something's illegal, but it doesn't necessarily help you if you get arrested for it or you get shut down for it. How about a remonstrance filed directly to the House? Well, you got me on that one. I hadn't researched that potential avenue. Still wanting to hear the story of how Justice became governor. I don't know if you're talking about the stories of things that maybe happened or didn't happen during the campaign. I don't know. That's for a different video, and there's nothing I can do about that, anyways. If that's what you're talking about. Anyways, though, back to when Justice Jenkins showed up on the Tom Roten show, I was kind of afraid to listen to it because, isn't that everybody's worst fear, that they pour their heart and soul into something, which I did in that case, writ of mandamus or not. The whole thing was about the Constitution and our system of government, what we believe, what our founding fathers believed. And when you pour your heart and soul into writing something like that and you spend your time doing it, it's always kind of stepping out on a limb. You can always get shot down. You can write something and it gets criticized or it's a failure. And in the end, we did lose that case, which we knew was a risk. But you can always lose worse. The Supreme Court can always, instead of giving no explanation, they could give a one-sentence explanation that says, yeah, and your lawyer is a complete idiot. So there's always a danger of something like that when you're going to an appellate court. And, to our credit, I suppose, they didn't rule in our favor, but they didn't criticize us either, and didn't criticize any of the lawyers involved. And that does happen from time to time, and it's happened in the past. So I was kind of scared to listen to the podcast of this interview because I didn't know what he's going to say. Like, they could have won, but their lawyer was, didn't know what the hell he was doing. Or where did he go to law school? And really, his legal citation skills are behind the times. I didn't know what he was going to say. But I thought it was really cool that he explained what, the history of writ of mandamus, as everyone likes everyone to do. But he also kind of got into the just general constitutional concepts that we were arguing in that case. And I had to transcribe this because I thought it was really cool. This is what Justice Jenkins said on the Tom Roten show about the brief that I wrote and submitted and filed on behalf of my clients, including Delegate Marshall Wilson. He said, "It's a very good read, the memorandum in support of these legislatures' writ of mandamus filing. There's a lot of great constitutional history. There is many things contained in it about the separation of powers and the natural rights rather than the government rights as the source of our liberty and freedoms. It's very well written and contains a lot of compelling arguments about separation of powers and overreach and infringement of one branch over the other." Now, that was something that was really, really cool to hear, because that was really where we were going with this. Of course, when you're litigating something called a writ of mandamus, there are ways, a million and one ways for a court to get rid of it, to dismiss it. There are escape routes everywhere, and they're all procedural without actually getting to the merits of the case. And even if you do get to the merits of the case, there are still 1,001 ways to lose. But at some point, just like when you're trying a case before a jury, at some point you have to hit where it hurts, where it should hurt. You have to hit on the most important thing, which is this broader concept of constitutional rights. And at what point At what point are we different from Australia? You may have seen on social media now where Australia's got people locked down. There's even, I mean, people are tweeting for help essentially from their homes. And it's a really draconian enforcement scheme that's going on apparently in Melbourne, Australia right now. There's a video also floating around on social media where there's an older cop, I believe, in Melbourne, Australia, who is just basically choking this like little girl, this little woman, trying to take her to the ground because she just wasn't wearing a mask. At least that's what the article said. And that's just basically taking what we've been dealing with here and just taking it to extremes. But if you stop and think, well, what's stopping West Virginia from being like Melbourne, Australia? I mean, what safeguards do we have that they didn't have? And really, I don't know. I don't know that we have any safeguards that they don't have. I don't know that there's anything stopping the governor of West Virginia or other states from treating people in the same way. Can they require us to literally stay in our homes or else, and have police go door to door to check, to have lines set up where neighbors can and may feel intimidated to turn their neighbors in for violating the law stating that they have to stay in their home? I don't know if unless we embrace these broader concepts of the Constitution, I don't know that we have any of these safeguards in place. So a lot of what we cited in our brief to the Supreme Court was what had happened in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And if you read the Wisconsin decision, it wasn't a technicality argument. It was a constitutional argument based on separation of powers. And the court actually gets to these concepts such as free, what it means to be a free people, and natural rights, inalienable rights. And usually as a lawyer, you get nowhere arguing things like that because it's not the same thing as case law. It's just a broad concept. But at some point, with these core constitutional issues, with West Virginia versus Australia in mind, what sets us apart? At some point, I think you have to argue, this is what our Constitution says. I mean, does it mean something or does it not mean something? And I think it was refreshing to hear that, we're down, but we're not necessarily out, because that's the way we were looking at this thing, is that, our constitutional history matters, that what's written in our Constitution about separation of powers and natural rights rather than government rights is the source of our liberty and freedom. That matters. That's not necessarily a case that we can point to that's legal precedent, but it's just a concept. So yesterday we had a private meeting with my clients who are the legislators, or many of them, and we have at least one new addition who wants to jump in as well. And they have decided, and it's not necessarily my choice at all. It's their choice. They're the clients, and I can do nothing by myself. And it's in their names, not mine. But they have made the decision that they want to proceed. So what we will do now is issue the same constitutional challenge, the same constitutional arguments in state court. So unless the West Virginia governor withdraws his unconstitutional executive orders, or unless he comes out, or the attorney general or someone else comes out and clarifies that these executive orders are merely suggestions or merely advisory and are not enforceable, we're going to file suit, because that is how I see things. These orders, he can issue executive orders. The governor of West Virginia has the legal ability to issue executive orders. That's not in dispute. But those orders require their businesses to wear a mask. He can write it, but it's not legally enforceable. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to enforce it, because already I have clients who have been arrested for not complying. I have clients who in prospective clients who have been talking to me who are restaurant owners who have been forced to comply with the executive orders or faced closure or administrative action against them. They've been threatened with their ABC licenses being revoked. They've been threatened with having their barbers and cosmetologist license revoked. So I mean, that's how the bureaucrats operate. They hit where they have power. So there has been, even though the governor's office and the governor are kind of shady on whether these are actual enforced legal requirements or whether these are just what they're suggesting or what they're advising, they haven't really gone there. But their underlings in the county boards of health, they've been taking these executive orders and they've been running with them. They've been enforcing them. And with all the people that I've talked to who are subject to these boards, and we're talking about restaurants, grocery stores, and other businesses that get inspected by these county health boards, they've been told to comply with these mandates, or else they would be closed and they would lose their food handler's license or whatever permits were being held over their head. Carmen, yeah, I don't think that I don't have any information on that, and unfortunately, I've heard the same thing. If it sounds like it's something to be investigated, and if I did know something, I probably wouldn't reveal it on YouTube. But I don't think know anything else other than probably the same thing that you've heard. And Adam, I'll put your comment up. Yeah, just do what the government says, no matter how outlandish, and don't ask questions. There's another way of saying that, Adam.
Again, I encourage all businesses that are allowed to open to do so only if they can follow the guidelines to keep West Virginia safe.
So, Adam, that's my advice for you, is to follow the guidelines. It's called strong arming as it relates to the mafia. Yes. Well, it's not all that different between the mafia and the government, except what's the one difference between the mafia and the government? Do you know, Adam? I know, because even crime wouldn't pay if the government ran it, right? Even the mafia strip clubs would go broke if the government ran them. So back to what I was talking about. We're going to proceed with the challenge unless the governor will announce and declare that his executive orders are not enforceable against West Virginia citizens. Where's this one picture? I mean, this is what I really want the governor to put up at his next conference. So I want this graphic used, and I want the governor to admit that he has no authority over the citizens of West by God, Virginia. And then we'll stand down. It's sort of like the scene in Braveheart, where the two armies are lined up. we'll let you walk off the field so long as you stop at the home of every Scot on the way back and beg for forgiveness for 200 years of tyranny and rape and pillage, and then you may live. Or I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So yeah, he should apologize. He should compensate the small businesses who were closed, the individuals who were arrested, who were threatened with closure, who were drugged through the news media, all as a result of this. They should all get apologies. They should get compensation. But we'd probably be okay just with an announcement, that a clarification that these orders are not enforceable. They're not going to enforce them. They don't have to admit that they're unconstitutional. They just have to say that they're not going to enforce them. Why? Why do we want that? Because right now you have all these little bureaucrats running around in the 55 different counties, probably not all of them, but some of them. And it's, I mean, they may have been a, whatever they call it, a registered sanitarian. I think they call it a health inspector, or whatever the case may be, whatever the position may be within local government. They've been their whole life, like their job has been, no one really paid that much attention to it maybe. But now, I mean, it's a state of emergency, and they're the frontline heroes. And that's how many of them are acting. They're taking it upon themselves to go in these businesses and to enforce what they think the governor's executive orders mean. And so all these people that I've talked to, I've said, well, have they given you anything in writing? No, that's been the problem. We haven't been able to get anything in writing. We asked for it in writing. All they would do is point us to the governor's website. And I think there was one guy that even said, well, how about you print out what's on the governor's website, you sign it with your name, then give it to us or give it to my attorney. And they wouldn't do that. So we also have another thing in this country called due process. So if the government takes something from you, or they incarcerate you, or they close your business, or whatever, you're entitled to notice in a hearing, a chance to defend yourself. You're entitled to know what the rules are, and to respond to it, and to argue that you didn't violate the rules, or that the rules are unconstitutional, or whatever the case may be. And there's been no due process here. Right now we have these registered sanitarians who have all the power of a monarchy, basically, so long as they believe that they're within the executive orders of the governor. They can close businesses. They can pull their alcohol licenses, their food handlers cards, whatever they want. But if the governor or his office or somebody with authority to do so from the executive branch will make it clear to all 55 counties that these executive orders will not be enforced, that they are advisory, that they are suggestions, then there's no need to proceed with a lawsuit. But if we don't proceed with a lawsuit, we have allowed a legal precedent, which we know that government does not decrease its activity over time. It doesn't downsize itself voluntarily. If it's going to happen once, it's going to happen again. So next time, even if you think that Jim Justice or whoever your governor is has done a good job or has protected you, if you believe that that's the case, and even if you don't want your elected representative to have been consulted in the process or to have had a vote in the process, even if that's the case, you should still be against it. And here's why: because you may not like the next governor. The next governor may be like, whoever is imposing this draconian regime in Australia. And then what are you going to do then? What if the next governor is is a Green Party candidate governor who somehow, through some political chicanery, gets in the governor's seat in West Virginia. What are you going to do when that governor says that there's no more fossil fuels being burnt, no more cars on West Virginia roads? You have to ride bicycles or you can walk. Well, what are you going to do then? Because you've already allowed it before. You've set the precedent with Jim Justice. So long as he felt that there was a safety threat sufficient to declare a state of emergency, you allowed him to run the state to do whatever he wanted to do. And you didn't complain then. If you didn't complain then, you can't complain now. Well, you can, but it's a weak, incredible argument because you were okay with it before. So you allow it once, you're going to allow it additional times in the future. That's hence the phrase slippery slope. It's always a slippery slope of loss of rights. Once one goes, it never stops with that one. There will always be additional ones. And back to what I was saying. Why do we have a written constitution and separation of powers? I have this really great book that my dad gave me that I've been reading and putting little notes in, called Founders and Frontiersmen. This book was published in 1968. I highly recommend it if you can find one. I don't think it's in print, but it was apparently printed by the National Park Service in 1968. And it really has some great information in it. And that's exactly the phrase that I would use for our founding fathers, for the very first Americans, was they were founders and frontiersmen. And that's both literal and a metaphor. See, the Revolutionary War, our war for independence, the rebellion against Great Britain, it officially ended in 1783. So at that time, the United States encompassed more than 800,000 square miles from Maine to Georgia and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. And I'm in part reading some of this. Some of these are excerpts from that book. That's why I just held it up if that wasn't clear. But 1783, that's kind of the context to look at the founding of our country and why it was put together the way it was. So at that time, 800,000 square miles from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. These are 13 former British colonies, now independent states, all along the eastern seaboard. Our total population at that time was about 3 million people, as opposed to the 330 million or so we have now. So at that time, about 98% of all Americans lived in these 13 former British colonies. About 2% crossed the barriers of the mountains and pushed westward. And during the next century, our country would expand even further, all the way from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. And that's the story of our country. Is we didn't just want to survive like they did in Europe. They didn't want to subsist as peasants. No, we didn't want to just survive. We wanted to thrive. We didn't want land because we were racist or bad people or greedy. But in Europe, in the old world, there had been no new land ever. And since the Vikings had found new real estate opportunities, there had been no new land. Now, there was all this wealthy land. And it was these 13 new independent states, and the sky was the limit, because if you could get land, you could get wealth back then. In 1783 America, 9 out of 10 Americans made their living from the land. So land itself was great potential wealth. But having so much land also presented the early Americans with problems of transportation. The speed of communication at that time was only as fast as a man or an animal could travel, which was about 2 to 5 miles per hour, if you're looking at any long distance over land. The roads themselves were rutted, they were winding, and they were sometimes impassable. Water transportation really was the way to go. It was the easiest, it was the cheapest. In 1783, we were mostly small towns. We didn't have the urban metropolis areas. We didn't have the large cities. We were mostly a rural people at that time, or small town people. Most stations of 2,500 or less. The largest metropolis in 1783 we had was Philadelphia, which was about 40,000 people in 1783. So yeah, Philadelphia was bigger than New York City. You might not have known that. New York City, Boston, Charleston, South Carolina were our other, the next closest cities, and they were around 10,000 people each. Baltimore was slightly behind, a little less than 10,000 people in 1783. At that time, what was developing as America was very different than what the early Americans had left, or their fathers or grandfathers had left in Europe. America had no king, no hereditary titles, no hereditary aristocracy, no national church. Now, we did have an aristocracy of sorts, made up of ladies and gentlemen whose wealth, family, elegance, manners, language, and dress marked them as special, but to a large extent, talent was a prerequisite of social position. So in United States society, as opposed to Europe, where it wasn't possible, life was open-ended. The careers of people like the poor boy from Boston, Benjamin Franklin, or the immigrant from the West Indies, Alexander Hamilton, they could rise from the bottom to the top. So in the relatively simple society of the United States in 1783, really very few large fortunes had developed, whereas in Europe, a lot of the wealth was concentrated in families with these huge fortunes, and they would retain these fortunes through generations. And there was a large gap between the rich and the poor. But in the United States, that wasn't the case, and the gap between the rich and the poor at that time was narrower. Well, it was narrower than it's ever been in the world at that time, and it's widened since then. But that was the state of things in 1783. So in 1776, there were really two concepts which help unite these diverse colonies, these 13 colonies, and that was basically equality and representative government, and that was the political revolution of the time, but it wasn't exactly what we have today, or as we think of it. So in the 18th century, the political theorists basically saw three components to government: the monarchy, which is the executive branch; the aristocracy, which was the legislature; and the democracy, which were the people. And it was believed at the time that should one of these three gain control of the state, that evil was certain to result from it, and including the people. So that's why we were not and are not a democracy, because the people were viewed as one of these three components of a healthy state. And that's why it was set up in the way it was. If it was just the people, that would be mob rule or anarchy, and that would be tyranny. If it was just the executive or monarchy ruling everything, that would be tyranny. So the idea was to keep, separate and co-equal, not necessarily branches of government, but parts of government. The problem was in 1783 that the United States wasn't guaranteed even the ability to exist, to continue to exist. Nobody knew if, the British were still there and they still had the largest navy and military in the world, and they could still come right back and we could continue fighting them. So, we may not exist. And in fact, a few years later, in the fall of 1787, there was a rebellion in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion. And that demonstrated how weak our national government was. Because remember, we didn't have the Constitution yet in 1787. We had the Articles of Confederation. And what were the problems with the Articles of Confederation? Well, it was too weak. We didn't have a strong central way to have a strong central military. And it was mostly just, the state militias that were the military defense of the United States in those early days. And then the federal government didn't even really have a power to tax. It could levy taxes basically against the colonies, but it couldn't enforce those. I mean, that's kind of like what I'm asking for the governor's executive orders. Like, yeah, you can say whatever you want in an executive order, but it's not enforceable. And that's kind of like the early government of the United States, is that it could do a lot, but it just couldn't enforce a lot. So Shays' Rebellion, that was 1787. So what was the outcome of that? Well, of course, the government put down the rebellion, but really it was the state government in Massachusetts. Because again, the federal government didn't really have a strong central military to put down even a rebellion of farmers in one area of one colony. So it was the Massachusetts militia that put down Shays' Rebellion. And people kind of understood at that time that, wait a minute, this might be a problem. And because part of this was over big government. It was over, government wasn't even that big yet, and people were already pissed, and they were already upset about high taxes. And these people had debts. And a lot of people in every colony had debts. So these other colonies, these other new states started looking around, and they weren't happy with what was going on. So they decided to call another convention in 1787 in Philadelphia to discuss changing the Articles of Confederation. But to make a long story short, they didn't amend the Articles of Confederation. What did they do? They came up with an entirely new document, and that was our Constitution. So the Constitution that they came up with was a brilliant document, and it reflected the time of its creation in late 18th century America. And these were the basic tenets that our founding fathers believed in. And they had a theory that there should be a written agreement, a compact between the people and the government, and that these things should be written down. Our fundamental understandings of what this agreement is that both sides are agreeing to, it needs to be in writing. So the Constitution reaffirmed that we would be committed to the traditional rights of Englishmen to the protection of life, liberty, and property. And that's why we fought England in the Revolutionary War, for those three things: life, liberty, and property. And so those were central components of our Constitution when we drafted it. And as they're central components of West Virginia's state constitution when it was drafted. The Constitution expresses the founding fathers' abiding faith in man's willingness to reason, his ability to surmount political differences by means of rational discussion and compromise. And as you see with what's going on lately, there's not a whole lot of rational discussion happening. So the idea is that men or women sometimes disagree over the meaning of specific provisions in the Constitution, but within its broad framework, that the mechanism for compromise leads to reconcile these disagreements. The Constitution expresses the concerns of the past, yet it embodies the spirit and wisdom of tomorrow. And it's been successful in doing that. But it requires these, not just the mob rule and not just the monarchy rule of the executive, and not just the pure legislative rule, but it requires these three concepts working together. And that is what they were looking at when they developed the Constitution. So how have we ended up now with a pure monarchy rule in West Virginia? It's because we've stopped reading our Constitution, or we've ignored our Constitution. The entire premise of our lawsuit, our earlier lawsuit and our next lawsuit, is that the governor, and this probably applies in multiple states, that the governor has exceeded his lawful authority in declaring a perpetual and unrestricted state of emergency in West Virginia due to COVID-19, where he is able to unilaterally assert and continue to assert power, the power of both the executive and the legislative branches. Now, the governor will argue that he has emergency powers under the West Virginia Code, and that's West Virginia Code 1556, and he relies on those emergency powers. However, the West Virginia Code is subservient to the West Virginia Constitution. The West Virginia Constitution says that it will never be suspended, even in times of war. So the governor has demonstrably and egregiously exceeded his lawful powers that he was given in the Constitution. Our argument is that he has the responsibility and the obligation to call or convene a special session of the legislature if he believes that the public safety and welfare require legislation in response to an emergency. So the governor cannot lawfully refrain from convening the legislature and instead himself unilaterally take their powers instead of them using it. The governor may not unconstitutionally expand the power of the executive branch to the detriment of the legislative branch. So, looking at the emergency powers, nothing in there, if you read them, West Virginia Code 1556, despite what some may term as broad language, they cannot suspend the rights and obligations in the state constitution. They say nothing about being able to close the state's economy, about being to shut down the state. If you look at the governor's executive orders, I mean, he uses the verbiage shut down, the shutdown order, the stay-at-home order. Show me where in West Virginia Code 1556 any of these terms are used. They're not. The statute says nothing of the sort. And again, I go back to, let's just look at the words that were written in our state constitution. As the Justice Jenkins pointed out, it's very clear, and it talks about our rights as a free people. In fact, the Constitution, it instructs and commands our governor from our state government to protect and guard the citizens from intrusions on their liberty. It specifically says that. The very purpose of West Virginia's state government is to guard and protect the people of West Virginia from any and all encroachments on their liberty. You can read it, West Virginia Constitution, Article 1, Sections 2 and 3. And it says this, quote, "It is the high and solemn duty of the several departments of government created by this Constitution to guard and protect the people of this state from all encroachments upon the rights so reserved." Now, has that been violated in these past 5 months, or has that been violated in these past 5 months? Additionally, if looking at the West Virginia Constitution, it solidifies the underlying principle that's asserted in the Declaration of Independence, that all rights secured by our constitutions are natural rights endowed by our Creator, that they will never be suspended under any circumstances. I'll point you to West Virginia Constitution, Article 1, Section 3. It says, quote, "The provisions of this Constitution of the United States and of this state are operative alike in a period of war as in time of peace. Departure from or violation thereof under the plea of necessity or any other plea is subversive of good government and tends to anarchy and despotism." All we have to do is read our state constitution. It's like these guys saw exactly what would happen, because hasn't this story been repeated over thousands of years? All we have to do is look at history. Anytime there's been any government, anyone involved in that government has wanted to increase their power. And what's the saying that power corrupts? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So right now, governors across our country, including our governor, they're drunk with power. They have absolute power. Well, who wants to give that up? Now, a George Washington type would give that up because he loved his country more than he wanted to take advantage of his position. We know that. But, we don't have many George Washingtons running around involved in government anymore. Generally, we have a lot of people who couldn't hack it in the private sector, who just wanted to be in government because they wanted power. West Virginia was founded on the principle that power resides in the people and can only be exercised pursuant to the will of the people. West Virginia Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. I'll read, quote, "The powers of government reside in all the citizens of the state and can be rightfully exercised only in accordance with their will and appointment." All we have to do is read it. Is that being followed? No, that's being violated every minute of every day. So West Virginia's founding document declares in no uncertain terms that West Virginia is a free society and that no government can deprive a free people of their inherent natural rights. West Virginia Constitution, Article 3, Section 1. Quote, "All men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and of pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety." So where in that phrase did I miss that it says it's the government's job to keep us safe at all costs? No. It says we have natural rights to the enjoyment of our life, our liberty, and to pursue and acquire wealth. Meanwhile, the governor of the state is divesting people of their wealth by closing their barbershops and arresting them if they disobey the order, or closing their restaurants. How does that jive with what I just read in the Constitution? Can any executive order violate any provision of the Constitution? No. Well, they both can't be true. They both can't be true. So we can't have the enjoyment of life and liberty and the ability to acquire and possess property and pursue and obtain happiness and safety, and also be made to stay in our homes and wear a mask on our face and not be able to go get our hair cut. Instead, we live in a world now where, in order to protect our elderly citizens, we're basically abusing them. So I have a 96-year-old grandmother who has been perfectly healthy and able to drive herself around, go get her hair cut. But now she can't go anywhere. She can't see her family. She can't see her friends, and she's depressed. I have a mother-in-law in her 80s who is not allowed to see her husband of 50 plus years, except for once a week or month. And then they have to stay 6 feet apart and wear a mask, can't touch each other. And someone has to watch and make sure that they don't touch each other. I mean, at what point did we allow government to decide that our only interest is to survive? Because if that's the goal in life, is just to survive, we could create these nice little cubicles we can put people in, and we can put all our old people in these cubicles, and we could just put a feeding tube through the wall, and we can get them food, and it can be perfectly sanitary, healthy food, and we can get them all the water, that they can drink, and they'll be completely safe. Nobody will go in there and contaminate the little room that they're in, and we can keep them alive. I mean, we can probably keep them alive till 101. And we could start younger. We could just put people when they're young in these little cubicles. We could make a whole high-rise building full of little cubicles, like little jail cells full of people, and we keep them safe. They're not dying in car wrecks. They're not getting hit by cars walking across the street. They're not getting fat and having heart attacks. They're not drinking sugary drinks. They're not going to get hit by lightning. I mean, we will keep them safe, and we'll keep them alive. The government will keep them alive. And if that's our only goal is to survive, then maybe that's what government needs to do. But you know what? We didn't fight the war against England just because we wanted to survive. We didn't fight a war over life, liberty, and property just because we wanted to survive. We didn't expand our country all the way from the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific Ocean in 100 years because we wanted to survive. And that's the reason that they attack us now, that they call our founding fathers racist, that they call America racist, that they hate us, because the spirit of America has always been that we weren't just okay with surviving like the peasants in Europe. We wanted to thrive, because we came here in the first place because we wanted something better. And we kept moving west because we wanted more land for less. We wanted to build wealth. We wanted to thrive. We wanted our kids to have more than we had, our grandkids to have more than they have. And somehow now that's evil. And that's no longer something worth looking at. So the question is do we want to just survive, or can we go back to wanting to thrive? And is it the government's business that we want to thrive? I mean, last time I checked, it says in our state constitution that we're allowed to thrive. We're allowed to try to acquire wealth. We're allowed to keep our wealth. And now the only goal in life has become to protect you from this virus, to keep you in a safe space. So, what's the point? The government cannot rule the state in the event of a threat to public safety or welfare. As a state of emergency monarchy, basically, period. The government cannot do that. The governor can't rule the state by himself without the legislature, period. The governor, what are his options if he thinks there's a dangerous threat to the safety of the people in the state? The governor alone, when the legislature's out of session, which is what we've been in. So the legislature meets like January or February, March, 3 months there, and then they're at their day jobs the rest of the year. And if in the rest of the year the governor thinks that there's some sort of public safety or welfare threat, he has the duty to call the legislature into session. So the governor alone is tasked with overseeing the convening of the legislature where required under the Constitution, or where otherwise necessary for the public safety and welfare. That's what the Constitution says. Article 6, Section 18 and 19 says that the governor may convene the legislature by proclamation whenever, in his opinion, the public safety or welfare shall require it. It shall be his duty to convene it on application in writing of 3/5 of the members elected to each house. So the governor has, whenever in his opinion, the public safety or welfare requires it, can call the legislature into session. Whereas the legislature can call itself into session only when a supermajority, 3/5 of each house, vote to call themselves into session. So usually if the legislature's in session, they have equal ability to get rid of a state of emergency. They can vote to undo a state of emergency with a simple majority, but they can't do it if they're not in session. And it takes 3/5 of each house to get themselves into session. If they can't do that, it's up to the governor, whenever in his opinion the public safety or welfare shall require it. And that is the big disagreement that we've had, because as the Attorney General said, and as the Supreme Court Justice said, if it says whenever in his opinion he can do it, then it's discretionary. Therefore, we can't force him to do it. But they're missing the point, because here's what I'm saying. Whenever in his opinion, so if in the governor's opinion there's a threat to public safety and welfare, he has to call the legislature into session if he wants legislation. So that's what they keep leaving out, is the last part of that argument, and that's if he wants legislation enacted. So yeah, it's discretionary. He can just do nothing, or he can do what he has power to do. But he can't enact legislation on his own without calling the legislature into session. So if in his opinion there's a threat to public safety or welfare, that's his option. That's his sole option, is to call the legislature into session. He can't just do it himself. That is not a discretion that's allowed under the Constitution. So if we look at what was the governor's opinion throughout this crisis, so did he think that there was a threat to public or safety and welfare? Well, let's look at some of Governor Justice's quotes. These are his words. I want us to be fully prepared and take every precaution we need to keep West Virginians safe. That's the highest of priorities. So if we're fully prepared in every precaution, why not call the legislature into session? He said, I hate that we're at the point we have to make some of these decisions. Well, it's the job of the legislature to make these decisions. So if we're to that point that you hate it, why not exercise that authority that you're given to call the legislature into session? He said, and again, this is all being done out of an abundance of caution, but we have to think of the long-term health and safety of our people first and foremost. So it sounds like he thought from very early on, and that this is from early on, that the public health and safety of the people of West Virginia were in jeopardy. So he didn't do the only thing he's allowed to do. He also said this, I would tell you that we should still continue to live our lives as best we can, but we need to be smart. You know, that's sort of like saying, well, I believe in the Second Amendment, but there's gun violence everywhere and we need to ban all guns. So, I mean, that means absolutely nothing when you say but. So yeah, we should live happy lives, but we need to be smart. And therefore, I'm ordering you to stay at home and close your business and wear a mask. You know, when he declared a state of emergency, we hadn't even had one case of coronavirus in West Virginia. And this is his quote. There are currently no confirmed cases of COVID-19 in West Virginia. However, it's anticipated that the disease will come to West Virginia soon. So all this was done. This was put into motion before we had even one case. He said this, we might be able to prevent us from getting to a point where we've got to shut down the entire state. But to do that, we've got to move, and we've got to move stronger than we already are right now. Right now, you've really got to bear down and buckle up. Now, that was months ago that he said that. All this time, he could have called the legislature into session. He hadn't done it. So when will the public safety and welfare ever require a legislature, if it hasn't so far? And he said, quote, this truly is real. It's the event of all of our lifetimes, unlike any that we've ever seen before. So why not call in the legislature? The Constitution literally says if the public safety and welfare require it, then you can call in the legislature to respond to it. It doesn't say that you get to respond by enacting legislation without them. So he said all of us are really worried. Where's our next paycheck going to come from? How are we going to sustain ourselves? I'm sure that's what he was asking himself as the state's only billionaire. He also continued, I will tell you that the government in every way is stepping up as a nation and as a state. You'll be made as whole as you can possibly be made. Really? Again, this was months ago. For all the restaurants and barbershops and hair salons that were closed, or outdoor recreation businesses, or wedding planners, or photographers, or gun shows, or whatever. How have they been made whole in any way? Is $400 a week unemployment, is that making them whole? Or even $600 a week? I mean, like myself, a small business, many people, I mean, hell, their health insurance probably costs more than that. I pay $2,000 a month for health insurance. You believe that? $2,000 a month for health insurance. So let's say that he closed my office and I had to live off that. Well, hell, I could barely get health insurance before I could even go to the grocery store. That's not making somebody whole. I don't think he knows what it means to make somebody whole. Making someone whole is putting them back in the position that they were before you shut their business down. He said this disease is really serious stuff. Please stay at home. Please listen to our order. Please, in every way, shape, or form, or fashion, keep consulting your God above, and absolutely every one of us will get through this. If it's that serious, I mean, he sounds like there's a damn meteor headed towards West Virginia. If it's that bad, it still hasn't reached the point to where you do what the Constitution allows you to do, to call the legislature into session. It reminds me of that, go back to Braveheart again, the scene in Braveheart, where Mel Gibson says to the Robert the Bruce, he says that if the people would follow you, if you would just lead them. And isn't that exactly applicable to what's happened here? All right. He switches from the Democrat Party during a Trump rally in one of the most pro-Trump red states that there is, West Virginia, during a Trump rally, becomes a Republican. Now he's a Republican governor. Can you imagine if he acted like the gnome in South Dakota? He could have said, the Constitution allows me to call the legislature into session to provide for new laws to protect the public safety and welfare. I can't do it on my own, just as a king, as a monarch, as a dictator. We have to follow the process that was set up by our founding fathers. He could have called the legislature into session and let them, the people's representatives, the people's voices, debate whether to enact certain restrictions, whether to require masks or to close barbershops. That's all he had to do. But I don't know that even crossed his mind. I mean, he could have been a champion of liberty in this whole thing. Instead, he had to play Mr. Nanny State. And you know what? I don't know, from people I've talked to, I think everyone realizes that it was a catastrophically bad decision, constitutional arguments aside, to close the greatest economy in the world, the greatest economy that's ever existed, not just our state. I'm talking about as a country, but they even closed West Virginia's economy for any reason whatsoever, any reason. It was a catastrophic failure of government and a bad decision. I don't think that the people will ever allow it again. I think the governor and governors of other states, they could issue another stay-at-home order and close businesses, but I don't think the people would comply, not again. And that's really the story of America and the story of freedom. And people aren't going to comply. And, any government requires legitimacy. And because you can't enforce everything. You can't enforce everything. And if people doubt the legitimacy of what's happening, they're not going to respect it. They're not going to follow it. And our government at multiple levels has disrespected its people and has treated them like, well, it's been sort of like the American Indian policy, where we go out to these Indian tribes and we tell them, your great father in the East has love for his red children. And, we bring you many presents and but you have to do this, X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's basically how they're treating all the American people now in 2020. So despite having the sole ability to convene the legislature, if there's a threat to public health and safety that requires new rules, new laws, new restrictions, he didn't do it. He failed to do it. And now it's been almost 5 months. He's been doing these awful daily press briefings that are just, it's like nails on a chalkboard. He's done dozens of press releases with these stupid little pictures, and they're showing the little peasants how to put on a mask. And don't touch the inside of the mask. Keep it on all day. Every time you're outside, just touch the ear loops and you be a good little peasant. We get these stupid little cartoons. It's just insulting that we've gone to, we've gone from don't tread on me to join or die, from give me liberty or death to here's how you put on a face mask. It's a sad story, and it's not limited to West Virginia. It's in a lot of places, except like South Dakota and Georgia it's been admirable what their governor has done. But ours is just, it's one of the sad stories, and they're usually the blue state governors. But here, for some reason, we're stuck in this twilight zone where we have a supposedly red governor acting like a blue state governor. Now, we all know that he was elected as a Democrat, and he's obviously still a Democrat. Maybe he's in on it. Maybe he just doesn't know any better. We don't know. So write in S. Marshall Wilson for West Virginia governor when the time comes, if he doesn't get on the ballot. Because if we're going to have a Democrat governor, might as well let the Democrats get the blame for whatever he does, right? All right, so the event of all of our lifetimes, in the words of our governor. And how does he assist us through this event? He doesn't call in our legislature. He instead engages an executive power grab. In doing so, he has drastically affected the rights and liberties of West Virginia that were expressly secured for us by our founding fathers in West Virginia as well. One of those individuals who sat in that West Virginia Constitutional Convention was James M. Burnside, who grew up out at the fort that I'm renovating. And these people knew a thing or two about what government, the evils of government. Many of them had grown up in the antebellum South. And some of them were involved in the Civil War, even as Confederates. And they knew that, what it meant to be free and not free. And they worded our Constitution in such a way as to protect us, even in the far off future where, it might as well have been, the Jetsons in their mind with, flying buggies and so on and so forth. So the constitutional damage which has been inflicted has been great. It is ongoing and it's indefinite as of right now, and it needs to stop. So we're going to try to stop it. All right. I'm almost done here. I have to go get a cigar and a drink after a long day. But just quickly, in other news, just minutes ago, well, it's not minutes now, I would say a couple hours ago, we finally settled the rogue parole officer makes traffic stop case. If you haven't watched that video on our YouTube channel of the Division of Corrections guy making a traffic stop of an oil field worker and turned viral video, we were finally able to settle that case and get the individual shown in the video, a fair amount of monetary compensation for what happened to him. So that was a good and a fair outcome where a citizen who had his rights deprived got compensation and got made whole for the tyranny that was exercised against him. And who knows how many years it'll take before we ever get justice in a lot of these COVID-19 situations. I'll end this sort of with one of my favorite, and I know it's one of Marshall Wilson's favorite. I think he told me, writer, one of our favorite writers, one of my favorite writers at least, and that's C.S. Lewis, and that's the guy who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He's just one of those. He's one of those writers that kind of like George Orwell or Mark Twain, who their wisdom, it's just fully applicable to the modern day. And sometimes I've said, beware of do-gooders. Well, where did that come from? I went to look it up one day. Who said beware of do-gooders? And I don't know that was a specific quote more than an idea, but C.S. Lewis had a famous quote about that. Talking about the do-gooders, or AKA the Karens of 2020, he said this: of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. So, again, do we want to... What's the point of life? To survive or to thrive? And I'll leave you with this. C.S. Lewis also commented on the same issue, though it wasn't about coronavirus. In his time, it was about the threat of nuclear annihilation. And there were lots of, their version of Karens back then who said, well, what's the point of anything? Because we're all going to be killed in nuclear war. And in C.S. Lewis's mind and his way of thinking, you can't paralyze your life. You can't destroy your life because you feel like it's inevitable that it'll be destroyed anyways. So he said, in one way, we think a great too much about the atomic bomb. Well, he was talking about the atomic bomb, but his point was, if we're all going to be destroyed by coronavirus, let that virus, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. And he was talking about the atomic bomb, but his point is that we don't need to be huddled under our desks for our entire lives, because that's wasting our precious time that we have on the earth just because out of fear. If we're going to be destroyed in a atomic bomb blast, well, then hopefully we had fun before it happened. So in his exact quote, he said, "Why? How should you live? You would have lived as you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in a Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat at any night, or indeed as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of railway accidents, an age of motor accidents. In other words, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Believe me, dear sir or madam, you and all whom you love were already sentenced to death before the atomic bomb was invented, and quite a high percentage of us were going to die in unpleasant ways. We had indeed one very great advantage over our ancestors: anesthetics. But we have that still. It is perfectly ridiculous to go about whimpering and drawing long faces because the scientists have added one more chance of painful and premature death to a world which already bristled with such chances, and in which death itself was not a chance at all, but a certainty. This is the first point to be made, and the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we are all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things: praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to our friends over a pint and a game of darts, not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs or coronavirus. They may break our bodies. A microbe can do that. A coronavirus could do that. But they need not dominate our minds. So again, that is C.S. Lewis, and isn't that perfectly applicable to what's going on today? And history always teaches us, we can see exactly what's going to happen in the future. All we have to do is look at the past. And with coronavirus, we can look at the past, just like the atomic bomb. Stop watching the news. Don't let the media and the talking heads and the politicians keep you scared in your basement for the rest of your life. At some point, we're going to have to go out and live our lives. And, in reality, we're probably going to die in some other unpleasant, violent, traumatic way rather than an atomic bomb. Or maybe we're more likely to die of some kind of awful cancer than we are of coronavirus. That's the sad truth. And so let's not spend the time that we have left scared and depending on our governor to teach us how to put on a mask and to lecture us to stay at home this weekend and you stay social distanced 6 feet away. I mean, give us a break. Give us a break. Anyways, sorry I didn't get to more questions, but thanks for watching. And let's see, a couple things. You want me to put on a mask? Come and make me. Give me liberty or give me death, unless there's a virus with 99% recovery rate, in which case strip me of my freedoms, my job, my constitutional rights, and put me under house arrest. And yeah, the governor's message to our founding fathers: they were not socially distanced when they signed that document. They need to put a mask on. They're putting his health at risk. So just remember, keep calm and call John. And also, like, our early American Navy, at least I'm speaking for 5 or 6 legislators and myself and certain private businesses who have agreed to join us in this battle, that we haven't yet begun to fight. So again, thanks for watching. using technology to broadcast from the beautiful little town of Union, West Virginia. And until next time, follow the guidelines.
Again, I encourage all businesses that are allowed to open to do so only if they can follow the guidelines to keep West Virginia safe.